So let's get started. In the introduction, obviously, your learning objectives are very simple ones. We think the Ofsted review and the vision they have of high quality science education is pretty much bang on. The review is quite, how should we say, superficial. It doesn't tell you much about the evidence, but the conclusions they draw about what's good science practice are in line with what most researchers around the world believe now. And we've interpreted it in 3 different ways for these 3 different webinars. The first one is trying to expand beyond, let's say, the content, the knowledge, into a more 3-dimensional approach, which reflects the kind of science we think students ought to learn. And that's what the research and Ofsted also believe. The question is how to do it. And we're going to explain to you a method called backwards design, where we start with the goals, and that's what the syllabus, or if you've used our blueprint planners, that's what that's designed to do, to give you clear goals. And then you work backwards from the goals and you kind of say, well, how do we get students towards those goals? What kind of assessment, what kind of teaching activities do they need to have experienced? That's why it's called backwards design, because it's so easy, and I certainly was guilty of this as a teacher, to start with the activities, you know, the things that you love doing, the things that will motivate students, the things you think they'll learn, but you put those in, whereas in fact, better is to start with what's the purpose of this, and then decide whether that activity is actually the right one. That's why it's called backwards. Okay, so that's what we're going to get out of today. And we're going to start with defining what we think, or Ofsted think, is one of the characteristics of a high quality curriculum. I hope that sounds a good plan for everyone. If you have any questions or comments, please do use the chat as we go through this section. This is the theory section, which I'm doing. And at the end of it, I will stop. We'll take the questions, and you can either ask them in the chat, or you can even, you can even open your mic and talk. And then we'll go on to the second section, which is Gemma's, where she will give you an example of how you can make perhaps a content-driven curriculum more 3-dimensional. Okay, let's get started. So Ofsted reviewed all the research. I don't know if you've all read that. Might be good if you have to put something in the chat. They came to one conclusion relevant to this webinar, which is that, generally speaking, there are 2 kinds of knowledge referred to in the literature as substantive or content knowledge, and the practices or the disciplinary knowledge, or working scientifically, whatever you want to call it, inquiry skills. It goes by many names. They're 2 different kinds of knowledge, and they are both equally important, and both have to be in the curriculum, right? And often we know that curricula focus on just the one at the top, the content knowledge. Now, if you look at GCSE, you can see that the inquiry skills part is technically worth 50% of the marks. So Ofsted and Ofqual are on the same page. Now, where do curricula go wrong? This is again from the Ofsted report. Well, the first mistake is to think that it's enough just to do practical work. This is the sort of theory that if you do enough experiments, then you will learn these skills, and that's all we need to do. But it turns out that doesn't work, because it's not just, simple procedures that you get good at with practice. There's actually a lot of concepts involved in understanding how scientists work, and concepts like, variables is a simple one, but then you've got aspects like reliability and validity and all kinds of things. What's a hypothesis? What's the difference with that? And theory. There's a lot to learn, and you need some teaching. The second mistake is perhaps an old-fashioned one, where we used to teach lessons on observations or looking at evidence, as though you can teach that skill, and textbooks still make that mistake. They have a chapter on working scientifically, as though you can just learn it out of context. And of course, that's not how scientists work. Scientists don't do experiments. You know, they don't say, today I'm going to investigate, I don't know, why does this plastic bag last longer than the other one? They don't do that generally, unless they're working for a consumer organization. They have questions about things like, why does, you know, this planet go backwards instead of forwards? And they want to come up with an explanation. And the explanation involves doing some sort of inquiry, experimental or other sort. And so everything's in the context of some phenomenon, some knowledge, some model. And so it's silly to try and teach skills outside that context. It's just not how science works. In other words, if you fall into one of those mistakes of not teaching it or trying to teach the skills on their own, this is a one-dimensional curriculum. This is basically where content rules and we're not giving enough time or effort or teaching to this other dimension. In case that's a bit too abstract, I think we need to look at an actual scheme to show you what's typically done. You probably will find this a bit similar to yours in many cases because we're picking something very popular. Gemma, take over.
Yes, so go on to the next slide. I'm going to show you an example of something from a very popular scheme of work that some of you may be using at the moment. And we're going to have a look at a practical that they've put into a lesson on friction and thinking about, does it actually teach those working scientifically skills that Tony said was so important? So here's the objectives for the whole lesson, and I've highlighted at the bottom the inquiry processes that the students are expected to learn. And you can tell straight away there's quite a few different ones there that they're expected to do in one practical. So really what I did when I looked at this was thinking, does that chosen practical teach those skills or even enable students to practice them? And also the important thing about having a practical in a lesson is that it's there to help the students not only to practice those skills, but to understand those other objectives about friction. So does that practical, do the results help them to understand the effect of friction on an object and where friction comes from? So let's have a look. We go on to the next slide, Tony. Okay, so here have we got a slide before that actually? Yeah, okay. So it's good to see the practical in action. So this is a practical that many of you probably use. I certainly used it as a teacher, and we've actually used it in our materials, which I'll show you later. But this is how they use it in this scheme. So they are investigating the force of friction on a box and changing the surfaces. So we'll go on to the next slide and we'll have a look at the student sheet that the students have got. So first of all, they're asked to make a prediction. Straight up, this isn't really a prediction, so there's no hypothesis to test. So normally when we teach what a prediction is, they've given a hypothesis, and then the prediction is what I expect to see if that hypothesis is correct, so what I expect my results to be. So this is not really a prediction, and also there's no guidance here on how to make a prediction. So I don't think we can say here that students are being taught the skill of making a prediction here. So let's go on to the next sheet and see if there's anything else. Okay, so the next one, they've got the method and move straight away on to another skill. So forget the prediction, let's go on to variables now. Again, we've got a little bit of guidance here. We've reminded what independent and dependent variable mean. Next slide. Okay, so a bit more variables control, and then we've got a whole load more skills. Take your measurements, put them in a table, and also even plot your results. So decide what kind of chart is going to be best to show your results. So lots more skills there. And I suspect when this sheet was written by the writer, who was probably a teacher, they were given a format to follow. So they were told, okay, this practical, you need to include the planning stage, the method stage, the results stage, the conclusion stage. And this is how most of these sheets are written in schemes of work like this. but no real thought then has been put into what students are actually processing and learning about working scientifically, and how this investigation fits into the whole lesson and helps them understand anything about friction. Okay, if we go on to the next. Okay, again, more. They're asked to write a conclusion, say if their prediction was supported. And also they have to talk about experimental error. So yet another very challenging working scientifically skill here, but no guidance. So you really will hope that your students have been taught this previously in this scheme so they can access these questions. So if you ask a student at the end of this lesson why they did this investigation, and I know this from questioning my own children when they come home from school and say they've done a practical, what did you learn? What was the point in the investigation? Will they be able to say? How much does this help them to develop those working scientifically skills, or indeed understand anything about friction? If they're concentrating on doing all of these questions and thinking about all these skills, do they actually know at the end what this is telling them about friction? And these are all important questions we need to think about when we do practicals in our lessons. Okay, that's it from me for now.
Thank you very much. So we think that's a one-dimensional curriculum because they don't get any points for the second dimension of working scientifically the way it was taught there or not taught. What Ofsted say is the solution is to organize your curriculum so that the knowledge is embedded, the disciplinary knowledge, the working scientifically is embedded within the content. So in other words, you're teaching some skill, some knowledge at the same time together in an integrated way. That's the challenge. And that's what we're going to show you how to do, how to add it, because it hasn't been done well in the scheme you saw. They're basically separate. You know, there's a lesson on content of friction, there's a practical, and they're not very well linked together. There's not much thought involved in what they're teaching and how. But it's not easy. You might say, well, that's too hard to integrate them, you know, or students can't do it. Well, I'm going to show you the benefits if you can do that, why you would want to go to the effort of using backwards design to put the second dimension into your curriculum. The first one, I think, is obvious that if you go to GCSE, yes, some of the questions are purely knowledge, AO1, but once you get to AO2 and AO3, there's quite a lot of demand on the working scientific side. So if your students can't really process that because they haven't been taught it, then they're not likely to be able to do these questions like the one in front of you. So read it for a second and think. This is a process called cognitive task analysis, where you try and think, what would a student have to think about in order to get this question right? Let's imagine the thought processes here. So pretend you're a student, you're answering this question, you're a good student, and you think you should be able to do it. What's the thinking process? And then I'll give you my view in a minute. Okay, perhaps if you're ready, we can look at what might be the thinking process. So this is my thinking process, and I'm a non-biologist, right? So I may have got the biology a bit wrong, but I'm more interested in the working scientifically. So you read it and you think, okay, there's a phenomenon here. This baobab tree grows in Africa. it loses its leaves for 9 months of the year. That is the phenomenon. That's the real world observation. And my job is to explain it. That is, after all, what scientists do. That's the whole point of working scientifically, is if you know content, if you know the skills, you should be able to explain things in the real world when you come to them. That's where we learn science. So can we explain it? Well, first thing we recognize is actually we have got some data, and we know scientists use data, don't we? Because we've been told that. We've done lots of practical work. The data shows that, yes, indeed, this plant does lose its leaves for most of the year. But, at the same time, at the same time as that, the rainfall is low. So there's a connection between the two. Now, this is where I have to come up with a hypothesis. And my hypothesis would be, well, if there's a connection, then perhaps the rainfall, or the lack of it, is causing the tree to lose its leaves. So I have to think of that hypothesis in my mind and go, is that possible? It is possible. And then I can look for the biological reason to support that. But what I've been doing is thinking like a scientist. I've been saying, got a phenomenon, I have to come up with a hypothesis to explain it. I have to look for data and theory to see if my hypothesis is correct. And if I think I've got the data and the knowledge that fills in the gaps, then I have an explanation and I can write it down and get my marks. Now, imagine if I didn't know anything about working scientifically, that would be a lot harder because I wouldn't really know what the information meant, how to go about this process of coming up with an explanation. So I think that's a justification of why presenting science as a process of working from phenomena towards explanations is going to basically prepare students for these kinds of questions. If you agree or don't agree, write something in the chat. Have I got that roughly right, Gemma?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's benefit number one, which I think is a big benefit. There's a second benefit I think we'll show you later, is motivation. Now, motivation often gets left out of the equation when we've got so much to deliver, but it is rather important because students ultimately the ones who decide how much they're going to learn. You can't do that. So what is it that motivates students or people? It could be 3 or 4 different things, like autonomy. In other words, we all want to be in control of our lives and, be able to do things we want to. We don't like being controlled too much, certainly not when we've got beyond the age of 11. When we do everything our parents say. This changes when you become a teenager, and teenagers want to be in charge. Second purpose, yes, competence, mastery, being good at things. We know all about that one. And there's a third one, which is the meaning or the purpose. We want to feel that things have a purpose. And when we can't see the purpose, we ask questions like, why am I doing this? Because we don't tend to want to exert lots of effort if there's no purpose, right? There's a natural biological instinct. Why waste energy? And thinking requires energy. Why waste it on things that don't matter to you? And if you're only doing a one-dimensional kind of curriculum where knowledge is basically the only thing that gets a lot of time and the opportunity, then it's hard to give students much choice or autonomy. And it's often hard if things are out of any context to give them feeling that this is meaningful, because it's just more stuff to learn. Whereas if you take on the extra dimension, and you start off with real world phenomena like that tree, for instance, if that was a real example, or you can think of millions of examples in biology of interesting animal or plant behavior, and you want to try and explain something that you think, wow, why is that? Then first of all, you can get students' ideas. They can come up with things, and you can involve them in the thinking process, and let's see what kind sort of evidence experiment we could do to find that out. Their ideas could be given some credibility. And so they feel like they've a bit more control over the learning process. And also, of course, because it's got a context, that automatically gives it more personal meaning. So I think it's a lot easier to motivate students, to give them reasons for learning the difficult stuff, which you want, if they have some context. All right. But before you get too confident that this is just about 2 dimensions, there is actually a third one. Science needs a third one because we're not just there to teach them the science stuff, right? Although that is the most important part. We're schools where the mission of creating, adults is to do with creating people who can think for themselves, who can carry on learning. The jobs of the future, for instance, we're going to require constant adaptation and learning new skills. Knowledge goes out of date very quickly these days, so everything we teach them has a shelf life. In other words, if we're just spoon feeding them knowledge from the past and we're not giving them much chance to think and develop creativity or independent learning skills, self-regulation, metacognition, all buzzwords, if that's not happening much because we're so fixated on the syllabus, then we're not going to achieve that mission. Simple as that, really. But there's another benefit as well as just feeling like you're giving good education, which is that in the last 20 years, the researchers clearly identified, looking at kids who failed or succeeded in difficult school environments, that it wasn't just, their cognitive ability that mattered. Equally important were these non-cognitive factors like mindset, about that now, whether they were academically motivated, whether they felt they belonged in the classroom, did they have some reason and purpose for learning? All these sorts of things matter as much. The affective side, because we're people, they matter as much, right, in achievement. So if you take that on board and you develop their metacognitive skills and the growth mindset and all the rest, and the ability to sort of manage their own learning, then of course their achievement will go up. So why wouldn't we give them opportunities to do this in the classroom? Because otherwise we're limiting how much they will ever learn. Okay. Have I finished my bit? Yeah. Okay, it's a break. We're going to have a little poll here. Now, I mentioned the Key Stage 3 syllabus was our first attempt to put the ideas into action. It was focused on big ideas and key concepts and knowledge, really, not much about the second dimension, and certainly not the third one. But I would like to know what you think from what you've heard. Do you think it would be worth, let me see, yeah, here's the question. Do you think it would be worth us, an AQA, revising that and making the second dimension, the working scientifically, properly integrated so you could teach them side by side? So we could kind of show you the best matches of what to teach with what. So I'll give you a minute to answer that question. We've got most of the answers in, so just a few seconds. Okay, just about ending. Right, there you go. So I'm going to share those. Thank you very much for giving us your support on that one. It would help a lot. Great. That's what we would hope. Because at the moment it was just like a page at the end saying these are all the skills that you could mix, but it didn't give you any help. All right. So now we've kind of shown you what we would like, or what Ofsted would like to see, and what your school would love to have to achieve its mission. Now comes the difficult question of how do we achieve that? And we can give you a good head start on this one, to build a curriculum that properly integrates these three different areas that all contribute to achievement and lifelong learning. And the basic model that we use, a designer's model, which is what we are, is called backwards design. And it basically means you start off with a very clear idea of the goals. Like if you're designing a product, you work out what is it to be used for? Exactly what should it do for which users? And once you know that, then you can start designing, the components. And that's the model we want you to try and adopt here, to add these extra dimensions in. And we're going to add them one at a time. So we're going to start off with the understanding, which is step one, the one on the right. We start off with the most kind of fundamental one, which is the big idea understanding, because that's what the whole curriculum structure is based on. And then we start working backwards and say, well, if that's the goal, what kind of phenomenon, what kind of inquiry would lead us towards that concept? As you saw in the baobab tree, if that tree was our phenomenon, we could easily lead to adaptation or some other concept related to that phenomenon. So that's step two. We'll show you that. And then step three is saying, okay, now we've got that approach and I did the analysis of what skills were involved. Now we can choose a skill that we want to focus our teaching on that will really nicely integrate with that concept and help students understand it better in the way that the example scheme we showed you didn't do. And the final step will be to say, okay, now we've got the working scientifically in the content, we can imagine an activity that students would do. And in that activity, they can practice one of these 21st century skills, whether it's teamwork, being creative, taking on a goal and monitoring it, whatever it is, we'll find one that really goes well. And there you have it. There you've got the three dimensions sort of baked into one learning sequence. Okay. Now you might think, well, that's a bit complicated. Can students do that? And so at this point, normally someone would say cognitive load or something like that. Oh no, this is too much for. Well, I want to nip that in the bud really, because much of the research that led to the American standards, which are three-dimensional, by the way, we have copied some of what we're doing here from America. Their research over decades was based on the idea that kids know an awful lot intuitively about how the world works. In a sense, like budding scientists. Here's a great quote from a book about called How We Learn from a neuroscientist. And he quotes all the experiments which show that even young children reason a hypothesis. When we look at things, we entertain lots of hypotheses in our head. And by the evidence, by our experimenting as playing, whatever it is, we figure out which hypothesis is most likely, and thus we learn. And we're searching for causes that might not be obvious. And we're doing all this reasoning naturally. We don't have to be taught it. So in a sense, we are scientists, informal scientists. So then, in a sense, it's not that difficult to add, the formal teaching to what students can already think about. It shouldn't be hard, certainly with your help. They should be able to work scientifically as they're learning the content. It's the content, in fact, that's the harder part. That's where you're going to have the misconceptions. All right, and the other, a big bit of theory, which I'm not going to go into, but it might be interesting for you to look up. It's called situated cognition. This is sort of the theory that says why we would want students to learn in this way and what would your role be as a teacher. Because if you're taking the three dimensions or even only two of them, you're no longer the transmitter of knowledge. Of course, you are going to teach. We're not saying don't do data extraction at all. We're saying there's a bigger context, which is in a sense that students are learning more than just facts and concepts. They're learning things in context. Learning is always in context. And you probably heard of these experiments where you put people under the water and they learn something while they're diving. And then they come up to the surface, they don't remember it so well, but you put them back again in underwater and they'll learn it, they'll remember it better. We learn the context that we learn things in, right? And we're social. We learn from people, we learn with people. Humans are designed to learn cultures. So before they went to school, before we invented the idea of school, students were very good at learning. And this is how this whole idea of novices and experts came about. This idea that learning is all about bringing someone into a culture. And in your case, it's the culture of doing science. And your role, in a sense, is the expert in doing science. You're more than the expert in the content. You know how scientists work, and you're training them to think like a scientist, act like a scientist, which is, I think, much more exciting than just saying, I have all the knowledge in my head, I'm going to pass it to you. And if you accept this idea of situated cognition as a very modern approach, then you think about teaching more as a sense of apprenticeship, cognitive apprenticeship, sorry. You're the expert, they're the novice, like your apprentice, and you're gradually inducting them into the practice of doing science, which is a combination of the knowledge and the facts and the activities they do, you know, the practical techniques, the thinking process, everything is part of this learning the culture of doing science. And I think that's a kind of liberating approach as a teacher. And certainly if you were a scientist before you became a teacher, you would probably naturally slip into that mode because that's how scientists learn to become scientists. Right, time for me to stop. Sorry, Gemma. Any questions before I let you carry on?
There's none in the chat, but if people would like to write some in now, I can share my screen if you stop showing yours, Tony, and then.
Yeah. Anybody want to talk? Anybody want to write a question? Feel free. Comment. If you're doing this, I'd love to hear. Okay, if not, we'll keep questions to the end and let Gemma show you the action, which is how to do this with an example.
Okay, I'm just trying to. Can we see? Can you see the screen, Tony? The PowerPoint?
That's the one, you got it.
Okay, brilliant. So yeah, I'm going to go through how we use backward design to design our complete mastery resources. And the idea is you can use exactly the same procedures when you are designing your own schemes of work. So if we go through each step, the first one then is to clarify the understanding goals. So you need to make sure you have very clear content learning goals. So here I've got what we've come up with for friction or surface friction. So this is exactly the idea we want students to understand about surface friction. So the first paragraph there. We've also thought of some terms that we want them to understand. So lubrication is one of those. So that's what we're aiming to teach. So the next thing we need to do then is to plan a phenomenon-based inquiry. So this is a phenomenon we're looking for that students could only answer by working scientifically. So basically what these are, it's showing the class a puzzling phenomenon or a real life problem and asking them a question based on it. And then in order for them to answer that question, they have to think like a scientist. They have to understand a scientific concept and then carry out an inquiry using the scientific skills in order to solve it. So we found that there's three different, we call them Ds, to use of each concept, and each concept will naturally fall into one of these. So we've got discovery, decisions, and design, and deciding which one of those can help us inform exactly what that inquiry is going to be. So if we have a look at each type from complete mastery, you can get an idea of what we mean by each of these. So this is an example of a decision. We've used this in our feeding relationship lesson. So we're giving students a real world issue to solve. So this could be in terms of health, or in this case, it's the environment. So the question we're asking them then is producing fish oil pills from krill harming killer whales? So in order for the students to actually answer that question, they have to understand food webs and how killer whales are linked to krill. So it gives them the motivation then to learn about food webs so they can understand this concept and answer the question. So the next D is design. So in this, students are using science to solve a problem or a challenge. So in this example, which is from resistance, students are asked to design a circuit for a toy robot that walks along, and to figure out how to give the robot different speeds, they need to understand how we can vary current, and that leads into resistance. And the final D then is discovery. So in discovery, it's when students are actually carrying out an investigation to help them understand a concept. So we're going to go back to friction here. So we've given them a bit of a story about a woman who slips over at work, hurts her back, and the company lawyers are not going to pay out any compensation because they're saying it's her fault. It was her shoes were too old, the soles are worn, and she slipped over. So that's leading up to this question, what makes a shoe slip or not? So rather than just going ahead and doing that practical that I showed you earlier, we're actually giving students a reason to do the practical and a reason to find out what affects friction. So they're going to carry out that investigation into the factors that affect the size of friction. So we now have our, if we go back to friction, we now have our problem that we're going to solve. So they need to understand how friction works in order to figure out what affects it, what factors affect friction. So having that problem there means that the students are taking ownership of this goal. They've got a reason, a motivation to find out about friction. It's not something that we're just imposing on them, you know, you have to learn this. They're seeing how actually it's going to help them solve this problem. So the next thing we need to do then is to figure out what activities we can actually put in there where they're going to gain that knowledge and also some skills to help them to answer that problem. So we're going to do the same investigation as we did before, the one that I showed you before. They're going to use this simplified shoe to test different variables to find out what affects the force of friction. So that leads us on then, that's our phenomenon-based inquiry. And then we're going to think about what working scientifically skills fit best with that practical, that investigation. So here's the skills that we've come up with in complete mastery. We've got 27 different skills, and these are skills that need to be taught over the 5 years. So we've got investigation skills, lots of those, practical skills, they're actually from GCSE. So you know there's required practicals and practical skills they need to do. Information, language, and also some math skills as well. So we've got a broad range of skills to choose from, but which one actually is going to fit into that practical? We're not going to fall into the trap of, well, actually, you could probably do most of those investigation skills, but we're not going to do them all. We're going to focus on one only, and we're going to teach it properly. So when you do this, you need to think about that practical and what students actually find difficult about it. What teaching opportunity is there for this one? And if you've ever done this practical before, you will find that when students get their results, they're often not very accurate. They find it quite difficult to measure the force on that Newton meter to when it just moves the actual object. So they find that difficult. So it really gives a very good opportunity to teach about experimental limitations. So of course the students will be using those other skills, like they're going to be thinking about variables and the practical skill of using a Newton meter, but these are skills that we've taught in other lessons previously, so they're just going to be practicing those skills. We're not going to focus on those. And also you can actually include, you can tell them what the variables are going to be. They don't have to identify them in this lesson. That's not the point of this. So then when they've done that practical and you teach about friction, they've got that concrete experience they've just had. They know that just having the table underneath the sole is going to create more friction. They've just experienced it. So when you teach them the model, they can make that connection there. So we've got our second objective then, our scientific, learning scientifically objective, to collect accurate data in an investigation. So how actually are we going to teach this? So I said we were going to teach about experimental limitations. How actually are you going to do this in the lesson? Well, we think that using this method called EDGE is a really good way of teaching students skills, and it's a series of steps. So the things that you might do slightly differently from what you do at the moment are the explain stage. You're going to actually tell the students why they need to use this skill, when is it important to use it. And then the enable stage at the end, where you're actually going to get students to use the skill again, but with no help this time. So let's see how that works then using friction as the example. So let's start off with the explain stage. And we're going to use this just in time. So I'll explain what that means. And the demonstrate. Let's have a look at those two. So in this example, in friction, we're going to introduce the experiment, and they're going to get into their groups and they have a go at doing the experiment. They follow a method, they have a go. We call this a trial run, basically. And then we're going to stop them. And this is where we're going to teach the skill just in time, because they're going to notice that their results are not very similar. So you take over, stop them, take over, and do a little bit of teaching at this point. So review your trial run. Were your results looking like this? So was there a big difference between them? And get them to discuss in their groups what could have caused that big range in the results there. And then you're going to demonstrate, you're going to give them some reasons why. So just a couple given here, reasons for that big range. So did they use that Newton meter incorrectly? Was that the correct instrument to use? And then they can go back and discuss in their groups again, what are they going to improve this time to improve that method? And then they go back and they repeat it again. They do the experiment again, but keeping in mind that skill that you've just taught them. So every time they take a measurement, is this accurate? Yes, no, why not? You can go around and discuss with them, you know, are you making any changes to your method? What could you do differently this time? So that's that skill being focused on throughout the practical. So the next stage then is guide. So they're going to use the skill for the first time. So that's what I've just talked about. They go ahead, do the practical, collect their results and monitor how well it's doing. And then enable. So they're going to use that skill again, but with no help from you this time. So in our resources, we have a question at the end, which is always a working scientifically question. So in this example, this is the question on data limitations. So they are going to answer this question by themselves and check that they got the answer correct. And also, of course, this skill is going to be practiced in future lessons. So you will come back and use this skill again without that guidance this time, without that edge teaching. Then we'll go straight on to the enable stage. So the final thing, we've got the working scientifically skill now. We need to think about integrating that 21st century skill. So here are some of the skills that we've identified that are important for students to think like scientists. So we've grouped them into these groups here: self-learning, creativity, interpersonal teamwork, critical thinking. And every time we come up with an activity in a lesson, we think about which skill would best fit into that activity. And in friction, we decided that sharing different ideas in a team is important, and when I explain to you the example, the different points of discussion during that, you can understand why. The students are spotting those limitations of their data as they're doing the experiment, discussing with each other what they can change. So they're sharing different ideas, listening to each other. So this objective is a really good match. So this is the guide from this lesson, and it explains in detail for the teacher how they can support their students in this skill during the practical. Okay, is there any, do we want to talk about any questions at this point?
We don't seem to have any more questions.
Okay.
I think we've left everybody flabbergasted.
Too much information. Okay, well, I'll go on to an exciting new project that we're doing at the moment called Connect. So these are free resources that are available on our website, and the link is below there. And these resources do everything that I've just said. So they've been designed to combine knowledge, inquiry, and 21st century skills into the one activity. So there's a variety of different resources there from different subjects. So if you want to have a go at those and put those ideas into practice, then you can. And as an extra incentive for having a go at those, we're looking for teachers that are using those resources in the classroom, and we're offering them to come along to Barcelona to take part in a conference there and share with other teachers how their experience of Connect went. So if you're interested in doing that, then if you put your name in the chat now, we can get back to you and give you more information about how we will go about doing that. And
That's
just
great.
to show our other resources, so Complete Mastery, so the friction lesson I showed you is from Complete Mastery. At the moment, we've got a free topic that you can download and have a go, which is the cell structure topic. Link at the bottom there if you want to have a look. And we've got our textbooks and practice books available as well on the website.
Thank you very much. That kind of wraps it up. And we always like to leave the chat on so that you can talk to each other if you have any comments you would rather share amongst yourselves. Remember, collaboration and social learning are part of it. And then just to announce that next week, we will be moving on to the second topic, which is how to create kind of learning progression. This is, again, what Ofsted would like to see, so that you take students from when they come in, where they have some existing ideas or some misconceptions about the subject, and you take them on a pathway towards a more expert-like understanding. So we're looking at the conceptual side and how you can build up that. What's the sequence of ideas? What do they need to experience? How do you take them towards AO2 and AO3? So that's the topic for next week, and I hope you'll come back and join us then. So we'll say farewell.